Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the GDL podcast. I'm going to be your host today, Jayant or Jay Uppal, and this is actually going to be the second episode of Growing Pains, which is the business themed series that I'm doing in collaboration with GDL. First of all, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to everyone that watched the first episode. I got some really good feedback from you all there, and I think it was just really nice to hear that it was helpful for everyone. If you still haven't seen that, I definitely recommend that you do. I think it will be linked in the playlist series for this one as well. Now, the second episode is actually going to be quite a large departure from what was there in the first one. In this one, I'm actually going to have more of a personal chat with Sharabi. Shah's a creative lead at a company called Realities.io, which is currently a VR studio. They actually began more as a VR tech company that focused on cultural heritage, but then moved into gaming partially because of his involvement there. And I think he shares some of the stories there in the podcast, so I won't go into too much. Before his time at Reality, Shah was also a uni founder of a studio called Grizzly Games, which had a couple of successful indie titles release. So he talks us through his experience going from kind of university, starting in a VR company as an intern, and working his way up through becoming a technical artist and finally a creative lead for the entire company there. There's a lot of useful tidbits that Shah has in mind when it comes to leadership and especially learning and growth within the games industry, but more widely just in general. So that's largely going to be the focus of our discussion today. We'll have a little bit on VR, but largely we'll be focusing on his growth into leadership roles, what he thinks happens to you as a person as you sort of take on that responsibility and mantle of being a leader, and finally pursuing sort of learning to better yourself as well. So it's quite a rounded conversational episode than the last one, which was a bit more industry focused. But I hope you do get some interesting information from there. I think he's a very knowledgeable person, and I'd also really recommend if anyone wants to know more about technical art or about his views on leadership, definitely check out his blog. I'll also add a link to that in the show description here. And that's about it for me. I hope you enjoy the show, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Growing Pains. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the second episode of Growing Pains. Thanks for being here. Yeah, could you just walk us through, I guess, the start of your career in games, the indie side, founding Superflight, well, Grizzly Games, and doing Superflight, and then like how that led to the transition to Realities?
Yeah, for sure. So I studied game design in HTW Berlin in the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin. And one of the things that you ask yourself when you're studying game design is this a thing you can actually make money from? Because game industry is a bit obscure from the outside. So for the people who are just starting in, it's not very clear where their role is inside the industry and whether it is a commercial, something they can actually make money from. So we were working on a project in the university, which ended up being Superflight. And it was me and two of my friends. And we decided to kind of like test the validity of the path, the career path that we have chosen by starting a company and trying to sell it on Steam. Quite honestly, we were not expecting the response that we got from the players. It was quite mind-blowing to us because we thought, a couple of hundred people would play it. We would pay, kind of like earn back the money we put in to start, like incorporate the company in Germany, which could be a lengthy process. And yeah, we got really surprised. The game kind of blew up, and that kind of made it possible for all of us to get more explorative with our interest. And for me, I was quite interested in VR, mostly because I found the prospect of a new medium which doesn't have pre-established design language of this is how you do it, right? So it's rare nowadays. If someone's going to write a camera controller, they know exactly how it should be written because cameras are controlled in a specific way in regards to controls and the expectations of the player. VR doesn't have any of those. So it's a very exciting field to be in because you get to actually set the foundation for the generations to come to how do we actually interact with the spatial games. So that was kind of what excited me, and I also realized that I would like to know more about game development on a more theoretical level and really work on my foundation to take let's say, the financial, the security that the success of Superflight gave me as a chance to slowly learn my way into really coming to love the process of making games. And that was basically the past couple of years in Realities.io for me, the company that made Puzzling Places. I started as a new employee there, and over the years, I transitioned more and more into leadership roles, and now I'm the creative lead in the studio.
Yeah, that's a really interesting journey. Usually, when somebody gets a hit indie title, they kind of double down and try and repeat that. I guess what made you decide to leave that company? I mean, you just had a hit title, got reputation as a studio. I think a lot of people that kind of start out from university that are looking at the indie space, it's their dream to essentially get to that stage, right? So, what made you give that up, essentially?
Well, one of the things was that we were students at the time, right? And we had different ideas also I mean, I'm very good friends with my co-founders from the time, and they're fantastic people. But we had at the time slightly different ideas of what games are and what should be worked on. And so we didn't want to necessarily work with each other on the next game anyways. But one of the things that I realized, and that's more of a personal reason for me, was I got lucky in a sense because the success I got with Superflight was what I envisioned my career to be early 30s or something like that, right? Because when people start, especially when you're young, you have this idea that you have work and work kind of like produces value. And people tie their sense of self-worth to, let's say, the value that they create. So when you start as a game developer and you're exposed to, especially this industry has a culture of godifying people. So you look
Mm,
up at all these people who have done amazing
yeah,
things and you're like, do you know who that guy is? That guy made this and this and this. And
Kojima.
yeah, exactly. And people are always chasing to being in the position of having made amazing games. And I thought maybe subconsciously that's kind of what I want, right? So as I was as a student, I worked extremely hard, very long hours to try to get to that position, and I got really lucky. And when I say lucky, I mean I got to work with Paul and Friedemann, the co-founders I created Superflight with, both of them extremely brilliant game designers and art directors, and incredible people. And through their strength and the synergy of their strength with mine, Superfly kind of came to be, and that luck allowed me to peek into the life of success as an indie developer, and realizing that doesn't change anything in regards to my sense of fulfillment, which is a really weird thing. That's a
Mm,
conversation I've had with a lot of people who kind of quote unquote made it as an indie developer. The moment of realization where they thought that maybe they were striving for this success, for acknowledgement of a source. And because that acknowledgement hasn't been internalized after having made something really successful, all they get is um, what's this thing? Imposter syndrome. Yeah, I don't
yeah,
even remember
yeah.
anymore what the word was because it has been such a long time that I had that. But
Not feeling
like,
imposter syndrome these days, huh?
no, not since the years, because I got the thing is, like, when you go to, like, let's say conferences or places with a successful product, you get access to some sort of VIP treatment.
Yeah,
And one of the things that I realize is that it's just torture, because you're always in your own head. You're like, what if my next game is rubbish? What if I peaked? That was
yeah,
like first year in the game industry was like the end of it, right? Which is
yeah,
quite interesting because, but I realized at the time, and I think I actually have a word for this. Like, there are these people in Twitter. I'm not going to name anyone because I don't want to out my friends like that. But incredibly successful person, and in their mid of their 30s, they go on, like, in a supermarket, and the guy says, "So what do you do?" And says, like, "Oh, I make video games." It's like any game I have heard of, and the guy says the name of one of the most known games in the industry, and, like, the old lady says, "Never heard of it." And
yeah,
right there on the spot, the guy gets, like, a midlife crisis, goes and buys a motorbike and starts, like, doing these weird activities and bakes bread on Twitter or whatever.
yeah.
So I looked at that after Superfight and I was like, I don't want to be that. I got lucky to see that it doesn't matter the amount of success you get. You're not going to have any sense of self-fulfillment unless you have internalized your own sense of work and value as some sort of an intrinsic motivation system. So that was kind of like the main reason why I thought I would like to kind of take myself back from chasing the next product that would be
Mm,
very successful, and work on the fundamentals of why do I actually make games? Why do people play games? And why do I like to make art? And that helped me to kind of like separate my sense of self-worth from the work I produce. And then that was the moment, the magical moment when the feeling of imposter syndrome disappeared forever. And since then, I have never thought about how I fit into the rest of the hierarchy of game design. All I care about is the projects I'm working on right now and how much fun they are for me or whoever is going to consume them.
I mean, I think that's a really cool realization, and one I'm probably still struggling with, and as I know a lot of people probably are. So having that, I don't know, in your early 20s, that's really
Yeah.
remarkable. I guess how much of this understanding did you develop over time? Was it like pretty much an immediate thing? You're like, okay, I've peaked now. I need to find the next big thing, or was it like a process over time that you kind of figured out what you want in game design?
So I figured out pretty immediately that, okay, I need to figure this out because again, I was expecting to feel amazing after Superflight.
Yeah,
And it was for a while, right? As like looking at the numbers going up and up and up, and like, wow, that's amazing. But afterwards, I realized immediately that all it remains is the pressure of expectation. And I thought, okay, I don't want to deal with this. Right? Like whatever the rest of my life going to be, I don't want to do with this. And I wasn't really sure because I didn't know the answer of. I wasn't really sure how to come in terms with the pressures that a creator has to face when, because that's also the another bizarre thing, right? Like games are a really interesting medium because let's say you don't like the chocolate you just consumed. You don't go and find the address of the guy who made the chocolate and send them like a 15 pages email of like, let me actually tell you how chocolate is supposed to be, you trash of a human being. Gamers are extremely engaged audience compared
yeah.
to some other industry, and that's also true for entertainment in general. So creators are under a lot of pressures, and the thing that I found over the years quite interesting was the answers I was looking for in terms of being happy as a creator. None of it was in the industry. All of it was in introspection, like looking into myself and trying to come in terms with why do I actually care about performing well? Why do I care about making things that are successful? And kind of like undoing that knot of that
Mhm.
connection was actually what led to a sense of peace as an artist to be able to work on the things I actually enjoy.
And then I guess have you found an answer to any of that? We need to get back on track, but I'm just interested to know. Have you figured out that purpose, as it were?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, over the years, one of the things that I find that I came to enjoy was first of all is the idea that your sense of that your self worth has nothing to do with the work you do, right? So that massively changes your prospect of how you look at things and also how you judge other people. Like you don't look at other people anymore, and you kind of are like they are as good as the last thing they made, right? You just look at them as
Mm.
human beings. And the other thing is to you need more than one pillar of happiness. So creating video games is, and that is something that anyone who has worked in the video game industry can very easily relate to. Even with all the potential toxic cultures and crunch and all of that, creating video games is so incredibly rewarding. It's such a incredibly rewarding and engaging thing. It's like consuming drugs because it's such a interactive experience, such a iterative process of you come up with an idea, you try it, you get this amazing audio visual sense feedback from the computer, and you see whether you were successful or not in the design you were trying to do. And that could consume your entire life, that height of making cool things. But you need to kind of fight against that and diversify your interests, and you need to diversify your sense of happiness. Make sure you have good relationship, be it in a romantic one and friendships. Find other hobbies, like interest yourself in things that don't directly have to do with video games. Find friends that like are not in the industry. As much as crazy as that
Yeah.
sounds to some of my friends, like not everyone has to be from the game industry. Most of my close friends are not from the industry, and they don't also understand at all when I'm talking about the things that I'm doing. They're just like happy for you that you did that.
Having fun.
So that's kind of like the answers I have gotten. And the last thing is within the work that I do as a game developer, I have come to internalize my own value system in an intrinsic way so that I don't do that for the reward, be it monetary or otherwise. Uh, more most of the times, if I do work on something and I push it out there, the moment I'm done with it, I almost stop caring about it beside the feedback I get that helps me to improve that thing. So it's mostly like the craftsmanship itself.
That's really interesting. I think that's super insightful, honestly. And I think I have to put a bit of blame on you in terms of why I'm also in the industry. You were one of the few people. Well, it was the first game jam I went to. I met you, and you were one of the few inspirations, as it were, that made me decide to give up my stable life in tech and finance and come into the games industry. So yeah, definitely making the moves there.
Yeah, I don't know if I should be like you're welcome or I'm sorry. I'm not sure, but
Well, we'll see. I mean, right now it's leading to conversations like this, so it's been a fun time so far, and the events have been good. So yeah, I
yeah,
mean
that's
that's
amazing.
that's this that's interesting that you chose then to sort of discover more about yourself. You decided to shift to VR. Initially, when you joined Realities, I think it was less a games company, right? It was more tech, more photogrammetry, like exploring
Mhm.
VR. So, what made you decide to, in a way, shift away from games when you went to reality specifically? Was there a goal of eventually you're going to build yourself on VR and then transition back into games?
No, not necessarily. I actually wanted to transition away from games for a while at least. I wasn't sure if this is permanent, but for a while. As I said before, game industry has a bunch of interesting trivias about it that make it challenging to work in it. One of them I already mentioned, games, making games
Mm,
is extremely fun. And if you're trying to figure out what does it mean to have a healthy work-life balance, it's extra hard to do it in video games because it's so goddamn fun. And during the early years in realities, we worked on so many projects with huge names like, I don't know, NASA and Audi or whatever. And in all these B2B projects, I'm not going to lie to you, when I had to go home, I could not care less if the project was going to
mm,
burn down to the ground. Because that's just what the reality of a lot of B2B and software development is. You enjoy the technical challenge of working on things as a programmer, but you're not necessarily really emotionally engaged if you free this pointer in the line 56 or if you're allocating new memory in line 28. Like it's not a in a way that games get emotional in a game that your ego goes on things in games. That wasn't necessarily a thing in the software. So there was definitely that for sure. And the other thing is, for people who know me, I really enjoy certainty. Like I do enjoy. It's not that I have a problem with chaotic situations. I love chaos because I get to make order out of it. That's
mm.
what the game is for me, jumping into the pool of chaos and trying to figure out what does this all mean. And video games is like an eternal challenge because there is no system that explains everything, right?
Yeah.
Um, Jesse Shell, the founder of Shell Games, has this line in his book where he's like, there is no periodic table for games. Like no one has figured it out. No one knows what. And I have read every game design, like from the top famous game design books. I've read all of them, and none of them have really given you the sure way of creating a hit game or a game that's
Mm.
for sure fun. And that can be very frustrating when you are trying to figure out a bunch of other things as well. So that was the main reason why I thought, okay, let's do software for a while, and I could work on more my technical skills, programming, learn more C and C++, learn more linear algebra and calculus and stuff like that, and then kind of come back uh, what I could do with that in video.
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting perspective. But yeah, before we get into a bit more on that learning side, I do want to delve into kind of your take on VR, on what happened with realities from the start, like going through that process of you starting as an intern to the point of becoming a creative lead. So yeah, give me something about what you learned in the VR space. Did it give you everything that you wanted to when you were looking at a new field and trying to do something completely new creatively? And how did that lead to puzzling places in your space within the company?
Yeah. So the thing I was looking into VR for, to just figuring out the potentiality of what could be done with it, I'm definitely fulfilled over the years because there were so many things we tried. VR has these strange things, like if you create a very realistic looking eyes right in front of you in VR and you put your skin close to it, your skin goes cold for a second because your brain thinks, oh, I'm gonna hit ice, and then it just like goes
Hmm.
cold for like a second or two, and your brain is like, wait a second, that wasn't ice, I got tricked, and then it just goes back. And you can do this many times and you keep feeling it. And so this part of like interesting things that you can do with video VR on top of the things that I said, like establishing the rules of art direction in VR, of like how do you design well with VR, how does it connect to like architecture and stuff like that. This is what I mostly got out of it. But uh, So the studio I joined, so in our studio, like our CEO Daniel, he has been working in VR before it was cool kind of situation, because he studied cognitive sciences, and they were using VR way back in the days for research purposes.
Mm.
Maybe beside the Disney research, that was like one of the few places that was still kind of like using VR actively. And he had a lot of knowledge around that. So we were always kind of in this space anyway. And as, of course, Valve started investing in it and they had the first set of Oculus headsets coming out, there was a row of interest in the medium that led to various forms of funding and the potential of having a commercially successful game. And that's when we started like thinking about using VR mostly for serious training and exploration and tourism and stuff like that. One of the things that we realized, because we were combining a technology called photogrammetry, which is taking scans of cultural heritage sites, like real life locations, taking a lot of pictures of them and automatically converting them to hyper realistic miniature models. And one of the things that we realized is that, okay, we need games in order for people to care for the cultural heritage we're presenting them, because we would, I don't know, take the scan of the pyramid or whatever as an example, and people would be kind of blown away by the technicality of it, that things could look so realistic, but then they wouldn't necessarily care about it, right? And we realized we
Mm.
need to kind of frame these locations as a like a work of art for people to really care for it. And that's when my profile as a game designer came back in, also to help to gamify. And we tried different different partners, we tried different gamification projects, and that's kind of how it led to Puzzling in Places, which started as a joke of during an import to an engine, the pieces were like kind of the transforms were wrong, and then you had each piece in a different part of the scene. And I made a joke that we should have someone fix it for us as a game. We should make a puzzle game that kind of like puts these realistic models back together, and that's how Puzzling Places started. But the core of the thing was we realized that there is an interest in VR, and we started working in it. And we were working with cultural heritage and photogrammetry and real life locations, and we kind of like needed a video game to bring people's attention to these cultural heritage sites. That's kind of like what the game is.
Nice, and I mean it's gone on to be one of the most successful VR games across pretty much all the main platforms, right?
Yeah, I don't know about one of the most successful ones, but definitely one of the most loved ones. The game was best rated game on the Oculus Store for 1 year uninterrupted, and it is still in the top 5, top 10, or something like that. And in terms of financial success, it has been doing also fairly good. But there are some huge titles out there in the VR nowadays that have made $100 million or something like that, and that's a whole different scope of the works that indie studios are making.
Yeah, and I mean, what is your take on the VR space? Obviously, it's kind of shifted from when you first started with realities, with Puzzling Places. We've had a lot more new players. You had PlayStation trying to take a crack of it and then sort of back off. You've seen kind of HTC, which was the initial competitor, in there. Now again, sort of switching gears. We just had the Vision Pro. So, yeah, what's your take on what's been happening in the VR space over the last few years? Where do you see it going? Is there still potential there? Is that still an area that you think is going to grow and where you want to focus, or are you looking to shift away as well?
Mm-hmm. So VR has changed a lot in the past couple of years, as you have said. Different companies came in with different visions, and no one really knew exactly 100% what they wanted. But they kind of like took the entire industry for them, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right. And so it went from like this tech that people were enthusiastic about, that was kind of for high spenders and early adopters, into at some point the Meta Quest was, and it still is, like our average player age is like 40 something years, and we have 10% of
Yeah.
our players are 65 plus, which is huge. And it's a very weird audience
Yeah.
to have captured with like Meta Quest. A lot of our players have never played video games before, and these are all kind of because MetaQuest is so intuitive to use for people who are not part of the gaming cultures per se. So at some point, the MetaQuest came and became this console, kind of like it reminded me almost like a Wii U, that was
Mm.
a very unique thing, and you could do very unique games with it. And a lot of people loved it and integrated in their daily activities. And I think that would remain to be so as long as Facebook continues supporting the platform. But at the same time, it was not what Facebook wanted, right? Because for a company with $1 trillion, with like, I don't know, 40, 50, $60 billion, or like $20 billion quarterly revenue, they're not as much interested in, let's say, the tiny amount of profit they could gain as being the holder of the next Wii U. So they didn't really care about that. And Facebook is a very experimental, data-driven company that kind of like sets like a KPI, just goes there and carnage on the way, it's like changes everything and then just guys figure it out type of situation.
Yeah.
They did to their credit, they did a really good job at the beginning, and that's thanks to the head of the store and the Fed publishing kind of like a strategy team to curate a space where indie developers can survive. And that was a blessing for a lot of people that went in and they had the space to try new things and have a chance at the running revenue that supports them to actually try these things, which is the reason why a lot of developers moved away from Steam or mobile into VR, because it was a time where you could self-publish easily. You have a good game. It has very specific strength, a lot of weaknesses, but it has very specific strength, and you just go with that and you have a good chance of making, like, data was 30% of the games made more than $1 million, which
Nice.
is good. Like, it's tiny number in within the ecosystem of Steam, but definitely 30% of games on Steam don't make more than $1 million. So that was very attractive to a lot of people. And that has changed in the past couple of years. I think Facebook pushed more and more towards this data-oriented thing, and maybe they're chasing almost the dream of going back to Facebook gaming situation that they had, which was so hugely profitable. And I have seen more and more mobile developer-like mindset the past year, specifically from new developers that I have never heard of before. And I'm really surprised, because a couple of years ago, it was such a small space that every corner of the world, when you would go to the VR meetup, you would see the same people. But now it has changed a little bit. And some of the new people that are coming in are super focused on the funnel and starting early and building personas, which is good, great. I'm happy that people do that. But it's a different vibe, definitely, than the experimental vibe of a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so it's, I guess, kind of in the scale-up stage of the industry, where it's kind of democratizing a little bit less and then becoming a little bit more structured. Facebook wants
That
some
without
pay
the
off.
scaling.
Yeah.
Without the
Yeah.
actual new people and the new source of income, it's just the the bloat of confusion.
I mean, I feel like that's going across pretty much all of the games industry these days. So we are clearly no exception. I mean, in
Yeah.
terms of that, do you see VR still being the focal subject? Because I mean, I know when I've been to conferences, there's a bigger focus of XR. It's sort of fizzled out a little bit, and it's gone shifted with like the Vision Pro. It's going more on the tech side. And everyone's like XR, AR, VR,
Yeah.
especially on the gaming side, seems to have quietened down. Even Facebook tried to release their Pro version to get more adoption outside of the gaming space. So do you see this space essentially shifting away from games right now? Or are you still seeing as like games as the central focus for VR, XR related apps and
So
services?
Meta is definitely trying to move past games into social media. Like they're trying to push
Yeah.
more and more people into Horizon. And Horizon Worlds has been getting some traction. Like I do hear from some of our players to be like, have you tried escape rooms and whatnot? So they are getting more and more successful. But as I said before, a lot of the older school developers in VR that I have talked to, they say, okay, I would, okay, I'm not going to quote the person, but the line was, I'm not going to say anything. I would rather kill myself before I make a game like that. So it's a different vibe. Like, different people are interested in that type of thing. And so it could be that gaming might be shifted out slightly from it. But I don't know. It really depends on if it really comes to that Meta makes consumption of games so inconvenient on MetaQuest, which I don't think will happen in the long term, because the company is very data driven, and there are people inside the company that are more interested to go into the older school. And if there is data that proves like people are disengaging with the platform, they will kind of like pivot back. And so there is that. And then on the side of Apple and, let's say, spatial computing, really hard to know what's going on, both in the sense of Sony and Apple seems like they are quite disappointed with their VR sales and whatnot. And Apple actually as Apple announced the Vision Pro first, there was a bit of a buzz amongst VCs that haven't really thought much about VR since like 2016 or 17 or whatever. The same people started contacting companies like ours for, hey, do you guys need investment, if whatever. And I have a feeling that Apple kind of like scared a lot of those people again away, because
Yeah.
some other companies were like, oh, we're going to jump on the wagon and we're going to do this and this. And what doesn't also help is that Pico has been also a good push in the industry in terms of like letting in the blood into the industry in terms of funding and whatnot. And due to the whole controversy with TikTok and whatnot, they have been reducing also a bit the funding that they could be giving in the past 2 years. So it is definitely a tough time for the industry, and I'm not sure if it is transitioning out of game, but if there is a bigger future for XR, let's call it like that, there would definitely be more that is just not games. It has to be, because computers are also mostly used for things that are not games.
Yeah.
But who knows?
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. I used to be a big time player. I think we played a lot during COVID, and I think it's a correction that's happening throughout the industry that you're seeing a lot of these shifts with the we see skating in, skating out. Everything around games right now is a little bit toxic to touch for especially the people that don't understand. And I think it is kind of good that some of them have backed off, because a lot of that did lead to a bit of the tumultuous years that we've been having in the games industry, especially this year. Okay, so moving away from the financial before we say anything too controversial, let's take it back to, I guess, your time at Realities. What I'm interested to discuss a bit more is you joined this company after coming off Superfly. You're doing something different. What made you decide to transition here from a game designer to more like a technical role, technical artist? Why was that sort of the shift that you took in your career there?
Mhm. A lot of it was just interest. I have been painting for 12 years now. I love painting and art, and it was never enough for me to just paint, because painting is very meditative and very relaxing. But I also love the logical building of a solution to a complicated problem that you have in mathematics. That you kind of like, you know, go to a problem, you take small steps, and incrementally you look back at a huge solution and you're like, wow, did I make that? I really enjoy that. And I realize in video games there is a lot of opportunity to combine and have both. You can kind of like have your cake and eat it too kind of situation. And one of the things I realized though was, coming from a Bachelor of Art, that I did not know anything about computers. Like, as we made Superflight, I didn't know what a compiler is, which is crazy when you think about the numbers that game did. But I realized I need to learn, basically, and that was kind of like the basics. Going back to the basics, buying university books, and really going in and trying to understand, how is a CPU made, how is a GPU made, how does the hardware work, learning how to do C++ and C, so that I learn about pointers and memories, and writing my own game engine. And you know that was kind of like the motivation behind it. And I'm really happy with that choice, because I feel like it has unlifted a set of constraint for me. Like right now I do a lot more management and you know product work than I used to do before, and a lot less programming. But even then, it just opened all these possibility of space of the things I can participate in and where I can be valuable.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, you've talked through how you sort of transition into this role, and then you've been sort of juggling a lot of hats as you kind of do in a startup, and then really showing initiative, which has led to this sort of astronomical growth where you're now the creative lead of the entire studio. What was sort of the process for you at each step? What were the steps that you took from, the intern to being, I guess, more of a general manager, technical artist, leading towards like the creative lead? How did your outlook on the company, on the studio, on your duties really change as you transition from each step in your career there?
Mhm. There is this thing of like, that line from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I always
Yeah.
find that line to be interesting, because I think it's the other way around. With great responsibility comes great power. Uh, in most of the hierarchies I have participated in, there's always those tasks that no one wants to deal with.
Mm.
The annoying ones. Everyone wants to
Yeah.
do the cool thing. There's always a cool thing everyone wants to do. But I always look at that annoying thing and I'm like, okay, someone needs to solve that problem. I'm going to solve that problem. And I'm going to teach myself how to solve that problem. And then I'm going to solve it. And once you have you're then responsible for that area. And the more you do that over the years, the more surface area of your company's topology is under your ownership. And over time, it gets to a point where it doesn't matter what your title is. People come to you for solutions and for permission and for whatever. So the process was mostly value and problem oriented. Most of the time, it was like, someone needs to take care of this. You're short on hand, and I guess that's going to be me. Exactly. So how the whole thing has changed is there is definitely a move away from an individual contributor to thinking more and more about the team. So there are different stages to this. When I started in the company, it was an internalized thing of like, I want to be better in the things I care about, right? I want to be a better programmer. I want to be better at art and whatnot. And there's a point by necessity where you become a high performer in any team, where you start thinking about, okay, how does my skill set fit in the whole machine of a company? How does it map to value created for the end user? How does that map to my salary? And so this is the moment where you start thinking about less the dogma of what is a good programmer and more the practicality of how can I be valuable to other human beings. And then the step above that is at some point you start realizing that you start thinking about leverage. Once you understand that system, you start thinking about leverage, that certain tasks are exponentially more useful and more productive than certain other tasks, right? So you could be, as a programmer, for example, refactor the code, which would be amazing to your idea of what good program is and what good programmer is, but that wouldn't affect the value you're creating for your end user. Or you could go and have a meeting with the art department and say, hey, is there anything I can do for you to speed up your processes and your workflows, for example, right? And once you start thinking about leverage, you start realizing more and more that your productivity is tied to the productivity of the team around you. So in a sense that it becomes a lot more valuable to put the effort in to understand how do people make decisions, how is information being moved around the company, how can I optimize that? And that's the type of thing I mean, where when you start spotting those problems, you come up with solution, you go to your boss and you say, hey, I have a solution to this problem, can we try it? And that is what management is. Like, even if you don't have the title, that is kind of what management is. And you do that often enough, and that's all you're doing, optimizing other people's workflow, because that's the highest leverage thing you can do. It doesn't matter how amazing you are as an individual contributor. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why some of the best individual contributors kind of naturally transition to being managers, because that's the most useful they can be.
Yeah, but then I think when I'm looking at managers, especially effective ones, and this is something I definitely want to get your take on as well. A lot of them, like you mentioned, it's about enabling the team, about supporting their growth. And a lot of times, I think that transition gets lost for an individual contributor who's very used to kind of being the expert, knowing everything,
Yep.
knowing how all these processes work, taking that step, having people under them, and then delegating in an effective way. Because obviously, there's going to be inefficiencies when you're initially doing this, training people up. How do you manage that against, I guess, I don't know if it would be just the natural ego or just the way of doing things when you know you can probably do this far quicker and far more efficiently? How do you manage that duty as a manager to enable your teams even at the cost of inefficiencies in a company, and especially with startups usually having funding issues, usually having time constraints? It can be hard to keep that sort of sustainable, right? So
Yep.
what is your approach when you're looking at management and especially looking at teaching and educating and enabling those sort of under you in the hierarchy?
I think one of the most criminal thing that companies do is to like take a individual contributor that's really good, converting to the management and say, good luck. And then just gonna pull themselves back. Okay, it's up to you now. Because you don't do that anywhere else, right? You don't just like hire like a, I don't know, like a robot from the street and say, now you're in charge of our production backend or something. Learn how to program. That's just not how it's done. So it's not necessarily advocating that everyone should go and do an MBA or whatever, but there are so many books out there for good management, and some of them are really, really brilliant. And you could learn from academics who have a lot of clear mental models, but have never actually operated a vegetable stance. Like they're not really experienced in it, but they have a lot of ideas from actual practical people who have done amazing things, who are not maybe very articulate in saying what they think and are too focused on their subjective view, but have experience. And you can go and learn from other fields. Like right now, I'm reading a book from Michael Barber. So that was the one of the ministers from the Tony Blair camp government, and he was in charge of delivery things. So there was a special unit, and he has a book on how to deliver. And this is about how to run a government. And you would think, what is the parallel between that and a company? A lot, like a lot of parallels between that and a company. So yeah, but I mean, the first thing is to train, right? You don't need to discover the undiscovered. These things have been discovered since the time of the Warring State period in China. So you have like 3,400 years of documented history on how to be a good manager. You just have to have the time and the mentality and the mindset of, okay, I need to get good at this, and this is something I can learn, right? And that's the first step, I think, is look up to the executives of the company, because culture is something that trickles down. Do they really value spending time and effort to try to figure out how people can work more effectively, maybe to measure things like, I don't know, employee satisfaction, cost per unit, and stuff like that? Are they really invested in that, or are they not? Because if they're not, then of course that's kind of like as a value system passed down to the mid-level managers, and those guys also wouldn't put the effort in to actually get better. But yeah, to specifically say like tips on how to be good at doing these things, one of the problem with management is, if you want to learn how to hammer a nail, nails come in predetermined sizes, so do hammers, so do walls. That makes your life quite easy, right? We can make a mental model. Reality doesn't come in pre-sized problems, right? And what that actually means that nothing I say specifically of what people should do could be one-to-one carried over to other situations. Because the answer to the question 5 plus 2 is 7, but if you want to do 17 divided by 4, well, you can't just say, okay, 7, it worked for him, but what does carry over is what I meant before is, if you put energy and effort as a mid-level manager to be competent, and you make sure you have the time, and that's one of the things that is difficult, because in most companies, especially in startups, as you said before, you're always short on money, there's always pressure. Most of the time, even all the way to executive, people are just firefighting all the time. And if you're always firefighting, you never have the time to actually figure out the source of the fire. And then it means that no one is managing the company. Everyone is just trying to make sure the ship doesn't sink. So you have to make sure that you have time blocked out in your calendar to really spend time and think about, what are people actually doing in the company? How can I help them? Is there any blockage? Is there silos between people? Or is there something that we are not doing that we could be doing that massively improves the efficiency of the team? And then from that, you figure it out. Like, none of these problems are so insanely complicated. It's just that you need the effort. It's someone's full-time job to think about these things. And nothing is eternal. And that's the more annoying thing, right? You figure out, I don't know, like a perfect solution for the dynamic of your team regarding on how to communicate it between different people. And then one of them goes on like a spiritual retreat and comes back and is like a slightly different person. Nothing works anymore, right? Or one of them just has a son and suddenly is like a lot more ambitious because they need to provide for the family or whatever. So nothing's forever, and someone needs to be on the game.
Yeah, I think that's true, right? Every one of us is different with different sort of lives that we lead, and unfortunately, your career is not always a black box. The life changes will impact that. Your goals will change. Your ambitions will grow. You'll learn more. I think one thing that I remember when we discussed it that I found really interesting about your sort of perspective on learning and the way you got buy-in from realities. I think it was like you have 2 hours a day within your work time just solely for learning, right? Learning around new topics, learning about different ideologies that will help. How did you, as a junior, get buy-in for that before even getting to this management stage? How did you get buy-in from those around you and the ones above? Was it just by doing those admin tasks that nobody wanted to do? or was there something more to it? Was there something you showed in terms of your contributions that led Daniel and the others in the team to respect you and allow you to do that and have more control of your time?
Mm-hmm. As I said before, culture kind of trickles down from the top, and Daniel, our CEO, is meets the people where they need to be, where they want to be. Right? He's happy to kind of entertain people's aspiration of how they want to live their life, as far as it doesn't bring the company down. Right? So, at least to giving them the chance to prove that this is of utility. So I think that's the reason number one why I managed to put that through. But reason number two is I have had job offers over the years, like amazing companies, triple my salary, way cooler and more known projects. And my question was like, can I spend like 2-3 hours a day just learning about random things that might not be helpful? And they're like, excuse me, no. And I'm like, okay, no, thank you then. And so I think the most tempting one was very famous game engine just before they went public. An offer to work with one of the legend in the graphic industry for the graphic and GPUs. And I would have learned so much. And that was the main point, was like, hey, look, you would learn so much being in the team. You don't need to worry about learning. But there is a problem there. And the problem is the tension between a company as a money-making machine and you as an individual who's going to live past the company. The company always looks at who you are and says, okay, short term, I would like to capitalize on the abilities that this person has right now, right? If you say, I am going to learn things that I'm not good at right now, or you can't make money from it right now, but if you give me time, you can make money from me later. Basically, the company is paying for your education, right? And that's the deal you're actually offering to the company, is say, if you pay for my education, I'm going to be more valuable. And most companies, especially in video games, because so many people want to work in the video game, and companies are happy to abuse that in a sense, they would say, no, sorry, there are like 20 other people like you who are willing to 100% devote what they are right now to our profit, right? And that all just means that you can't work for these people. And that's kind of like the tough part, right? And I have talked about this with a bunch of friends who kind of maybe years later kind of regret a little bit having worked in really cool projects and bigger teams, but they didn't have the time to build their own personal relationship because they were crunching. They didn't have the time to change and develop themselves because they were crunching. And like the price you just kind of pay is going with companies that are okay with giving you the time so you can develop yourself, because at the end of the day, your 20s is kind of like the time where you're like a sponge. You're always like absorbing new information. You're always learning. And if you spend 20 to 30 in a huge company and all you're doing is like modeling that one screw model for a tank, by the time you're 35, that's kind of like all your personality, like Max and Maya, that's kind of like all your. But if you have the chance to develop a little bit more and read about philosophy and politics and economics and all of those things, it gives you the chance to know a bit more of the world.
Nice. Well, because you definitely have a lot of passion for learning and self growth there, which is really cool.
Yeah, definitely.
And always excites me as well to try and read another book. But yeah, before we sort of actually dive a bit more into the learning side, how has your, I guess, view changed as a manager? How has your personal management style come into play based on, how you experienced it with Daniel, with what you've seen from other people, with all the books? What is your approach to management, and why have you decided to go that route specifically when you're looking at kind of junior people and looking to enable or develop them?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest change that has happened is something that's kind of contrary to my personality, which is I'm quite assertive in my opinions, which could be good if you are trying to like kind of make decisions fast, but it can also be bad because you could silence voices that are a bit quieter than yours. And I think back in the days, one of the things that I just didn't realize was, there's this whole ancient question of, is there such a thing as a good dictator? Kind of like a interesting thing. It's like, okay, if you have a leader that never make mistakes, right? Is that good? Like, you have really successful projects, and you kind of like read about creatives that have done amazing things. read their biographies or whatever. For example, I have a book there from Saul Bass. And one of the things is that for him, his design studio was an extension of his own body. Like he was just looking for extra arms. And he would communicate that very honestly with the people and say, hey, if you have a lot of your own ideas, you should go and work in a different design studio. You're an amazing individual, but it's just not my cup of tea. I know the answers. I just want more hands to kind of like develop that. And that's one style of management for sure. And I think I started more in that direction at the beginning. And of all things, it was actually a graphic novel that, like it was a combination of many, many different books I was reading at the time. Like, I think the first books I read in management was, the standard stuff like Creativity Inc. and whatnot. And trying to kind of like understand, and all of them were challenging a lot of my views that a person would have the answer to a problem type of situation. And the book of the time was it's a graphic novel called To Kill 6 Billion Demons, which has a very juvenile name, but I promise it is not as juvenile as it sounds. And there was almost a fable, like a biblical story inside of an imaginary King Solomon who is incredible. He is the best leader you can imagine, and he makes all the right choices. And he puts people in like disciplinary jails when they make a mistake, and otherwise he's like ruling as a benevolent dictator. His problem is he can never die because he looks around him and all he has achieved in the millennia of his rule is he has decapitated people's ability to make the right choices, because in order to grow as an individual, you have to make mistakes. And then he just cannot die. And he's frustrated with the lack of competence around him, but at the same time, it's all his fault. And I remember reading that like 2 a.m. and be like, oh, God damn it. That was like kind of one of those punches in the guts, because one of the things that I realized is that you do have to let people make mistakes, and that means letting them make suboptimal choices. Never mind that no one is King Solomon. Most of the time, you're actually wrong. Even if you think you're the expert in the area, you are actually wrong quite often. But even if you weren't, you have to give the people the space to kind of make mistakes. And that changed my view of things, because after that, I don't go with preconception of how projects are going to be done. I go more with a sense of excitement of, I wonder what people are going to make out of this, right? And one of the things that happened immediately afterwards with the shift was people around me started becoming more competent than me in all aspects in which I was, participating in decision making before. And that led to the situation that every game, every situation, every thing we work on, they surprise me with a piece greater than the sum of individuals. I was not expecting that. And that's a very pleasant feeling of working with people. And that kind of flows back into your source of motivation becomes, how do I enable even more of this? What can I do so that people are even more amazing, so that people feel even more creative, that they learn more, that they train more, and so on and so forth. So I think that's definitely the biggest change that has affected me, both on the personal level as well as professional level.
No, I love that. I think that's honestly a very hardened sort of truth as a manager there, what you're describing. And yeah, I've definitely seen it where, like what we said earlier, a lot of companies sort of just be like, okay, this person just naturally career progression, they've been in this role 5 years, we're just going to make them a manager because that's just what's expected, without necessarily understanding what that means for the team, what that means for this person and this individual. They're just kind of left to learn it on themselves. And sometimes, obviously, with other tuties, it can be kind of hard to essentially master a whole new skill on top of everything that you're already doing. So to have that realization that you need to help enable people and actually get a sense of pride and get a sense of, I guess, satisfaction from that, I think that's a really cool learning that is honestly helpful for anyone in their career, whether you're in a junior position or even going into management. I guess going from that, you're gone sort of starting in the intern, getting up to kind of middle management, senior management. How has that changed to the point now where you're the creative lead, you're a director, you're essentially leading the path for the future of this company? So it's not even that you're necessarily looking over a team, but you're essentially looking at the direction for the future of the entire company as a whole, with people like Daniel and all of that. How has that changed your perspective in terms of having a bit more, I guess, say and ownership in the direction of the overall company, where it's going to go, and if it's even still going to exist tomorrow?
So there is, I think practically, as far as your formal tasks are concerned, there's not necessarily that huge of a difference, because like, let's say a huge corporation, right, with 40,000 employees. As you're moving up the corporation, it doesn't mean you have to have everyone below you with the same level of resolution in mind, right? And there's a certain scale at which you abstract away what your job is, which is there are like 7 to 12 people that are your direct reports. And some of them are maybe a little bit dotted, which means you kind of like mentor them, but are not directly under your business unit, but kind of like there's that. And then maybe if you, from time to time, you sample below you randomly areas to inspect if things are going how they should. And it just, at that point, doesn't matter how far you move, how many people are practically under that pyramid, because if it is made like a pyramid, your amount of work is not necessarily changing all that much, or the things that you do from day to day, which is thinking about training, thinking about movement of information, processes and operation in the company, 4 eyes, and rituals and whatnot. So that's on the pragmatic level, not necessarily. And in a huge company that has, like, let's say a public company with like a serious board of directors and a lot of politics, of course being a director makes a lot of difference, because that's the moment where you have to play games that are just completely orthogonal to the rest of the product and has nothing to do with it. But in smaller companies, that's not even the case. Like, our board of directors, Daniel. So I don't think I'm going to have any politics going on.
escape that.
Yeah, so there is that, but there is the personal level for sure that makes a difference, and that's some of the things that it takes a while to get used to. Like, which is, okay, you're making a mistake, and your mistake could mean someone else doesn't have a job security. And it's not the idea that I don't have a job that bothers me as much, because I would be responsible for my own choices, obviously, like that's a given. It's the idea that my mistake will cause other people, or the opportunity cost of the lack of my excellence is holding other people's ambitions and personal comfort back, right? Because there's this thing that more often than not, you're doing tasks which you're bad at, you're really bad at it, but you look around and you're still the best person to do this, although you're like, man, I'm not really good at this. I wished someone from the heaven would just like drop in the company who's just amazing at this, and I would gladly give all my responsibilities and whatever that comes with it to them. And that can be, wow, that can be crushing, I think. And I definitely had some problems with that. And my solution was to talk to a lot of people who have been doing this for a while and managing way more people and a lot more responsibility. No one had any specific wisdom, besides some of them were like, well, if you make a mistake, you just lay people off. And
Well, we've seen a
which
lot of
is,
that.
which is, it's definitely like maybe a mindset that is almost required for a certain amount of responsibility. Kind of like if you're a football player and you're the guy who's supposed to take the shot, it's maybe part of a beneficial to the personality that every success is your skill and every failure is the team's failure, because you don't want to be like double guessing yourself and you're about to shoot a goal, right? So maybe there is that, but the actual thing is that after a while you kind of like get numb to the idea that your choices are affecting other people's life, and all you need for that is time. Kind of like, I don't think there's anything beside that that can help you much.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess, how is that feeling different to something like imposter syndrome? What you're feeling in terms of sort of that burden of having responsibility for the others and their livelihoods, and you not being the best person at times to do a certain task. Is there a difference there, or is that just a new type of imposter syndrome that's grown with these new challenges?
Yeah. So the thing with imposter syndrome that I have seen is, it is, what is crucial there is that when you connect your own sense of value and worth to the work you do, and you say, I am not worthy of the success, right? And the moment you do that disconnect, you don't really care, because the work is independent of you. That's one of the oldest wisdoms of creation, is that most creatives see themselves as a vessel of creation. They embody the thing to be discovered more than like really constructing it out of nothing. It's like, it's almost predetermined. Like there's this famous line from Michelangelo that he sees like David in the marble and he just like brings him out kind of situation. And it's not the creation of Michelangelo, but Michelangelo is purely the vessel of it. So that's the moment where imposter syndrome kind of goes away, when you realize, like, you're a lovely human being, regardless of whether it's a popular work or not a popular work or whatever. And then you just stop caring. This is more, it goes back to a different part of our brain, which is being a social animal. We are created to care about this, which is how do we affect people around us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like it's almost a question of empathy for others and being mindful of others. And I don't even think necessarily it's a bad thing. And like, sometimes I just ask myself if anyone is competent enough to be dealing with series of problems that some people in power in our society have to deal with all the time. Probably not, I don't know. But it is definitely something that is a byproduct of us as social animals. And it's okay. We just get used to it.
Fair enough. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about enabling people, trying to support them, but as a manager, you also have to make those tough decisions. I mean, we talked about how some people have advised, yeah, just lay people off if you make a mistake. But I guess, what's your take? How do you give constructive feedback? How do you take those hard decisions in choosing to let somebody go, or give them bad news? Essentially, how does that challenge you, especially as you've grown into this lead role?
Yeah, I mean, there are two different things, right? One of them is firing, the other one is layoffs. Layoff is when the company failed at fulfilling the ambition that they had, and it has nothing to do with the performance of the employee. And layoff sucks. But I do think it's interesting, because I think both layoffs and the firing are done irresponsibly most of the time. But at the same time, they almost get a bad rap too. Because if you're in a strong market economy where there's a lot of jobs for people, layoffs and firing wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world. It would just be a reallocation for the persons. But I mean, at the end of the day, especially in places like US where your health insurance is tied, your visa might be tied to your thing, it sucks, right? So there's no easy way of doing that besides it sucks. But when you're dealing with layoffs, I think the responsible thing is well, we are a German company. We would almost never take investments that's so risky that would require us to lay people off, because in Germany it's so complicated to do that at certain scale,
Yeah.
right? So that is almost by law enforced that we wouldn't be in that situation. But in places where that's the case, I think the fair thing to do is to communicate with the employee ahead of the time. Hey, you are being put in this project. Here is what you're going to be paid. And this is a risky project. Like, chances are it's not going to work out. And then kind of like create a compensation model, be it equity or whatever, to say, hey, if it does work out, there's a chance of a big payoff. If it doesn't work out, you will be laid off. To be honest about that is important, because people who can afford that risk, it's a game that they play of risk and reward, they can decide to participate in it. So that's the layoff side. The firing side, I think one of the biggest problem is that people are conflict averse most of the time. They don't like to talk about the uncomfortable thing, the thing that shouldn't be said. And a lot of companies, they hire people without having a specific definition of the role or any training program in place. Right? So they hire someone, and people are just like unhappy in the cloud, like kind of like it's like a very diffuse feeling of, I'm not happy with this performance of a person. And then if you ask them, okay, what is the expectation of the performance exactly? That might be the moment when you realize, oh, we didn't actually define that role. And then, okay, now you're in hot water, because what are you going to tell the person? I'm sorry, you are not meeting our vague, abstract expectation. We never communicated with you. That's not a great way to fire someone. So if you have, so that's step one, define the role and expectation of what you expect the person to do for the salary they're getting from you. Once that to the side, you realize that that person is not fulfilling that expectation. You need to have operations within the company in which you communicate that pretty immediately with the person and say, look, you are not being the person we want you to be. Here's the training program. So you would have to have some sort of idea of how do you get the person from not being able to do the job to doing the job. And there's a very useful, let's say, diagram there, which I always have in mind. people don't do things either because they either can't do it or because they don't want to do it, right? So this is like a two-axis thing, which is one of them is the will to actually do things, and the other one is the ability. You always want to move your entire employee from to the top right. So people who want to do things and they can do it. Those are your superstars.
Yeah.
If you have a junior who wants to do things but can't do it, you give them training. Now, the problem are the people who don't want to improve. Now, here's the thing. If they don't want to, you're dealing with two types of people. One of them are people who are very low in conscientiousness, people who just are lazy. They exist in our society, as a normal distribution has two tails. It's actually rare to meet them in the game industry because they have to go through so much training to even be able to apply for these places that most of the time they do have conscientiousness. It just means that they're not motivated by your product, by your value system, by the things that you're doing. And one of the things that you can do is communicate those value system with them, see if that was a question of miscommunication. If it wasn't a question of miscommunication, then it's the question of, is there another role within your company you can give them which would excite them, which would motivate them? Bigger companies definitely have that because they can kind of move between different verticals that have almost different missions. But if you're at a company that cannot offer that, the best thing you can do is fire them, because they are wasting not just your time, they're wasting their mortal life. They're just spending 8 hours a day working on something that they don't passionately believe in, that doesn't motivate them. And they could be working on amazing products that would motivate them, and firing them would enable that in a sense. But all of that to the side, you notify people through regular systems of feedback that they are not fulfilling some sort of role. You give them the potential of a training system and benchmarks of how to improve. If they are not meeting that, ideally within like 3 to 6 months, you should be able to think about, like, within the jurisdiction that you are, if they need a severance package or whatever, in order to be able to fire them.
Fair enough.
And
I
there's no
guess,
easy way to deliver the news, by the way. It sucks for them.
yeah,
Like, you can't be like, think about it. Maybe in a year or two, you're going to be in a more amazing company. Like, spare everyone there. They'll figure
spare
it
the
out.
sympathies. I guess on that, what about the emotional side? You mentioned that, obviously people find it hard to have these hard conversations. What do you do as a person when you're about to give this hard news to someone? How do you approach it? How do you essentially stop that like uncomfortable feeling from letting you shy away from this?
I think the cost of not doing it is too great. And I don't mean that the financial cost, because the financial cost is enormous, but that's not the important part, almost. I think I always go back to, okay, let's talk about the cultural cost, for example. If someone is not motivated, it would frustrate the hell out of the people who are high achievers. Because the high achievers always look around them and be like, oh, I'm putting so much energy in. Why is that guy not doing anything? Right. So that aspect is true. And that one bad apple might kind of like spread the demotivation across people who were otherwise having a amazing time. And that's some of the things I have seen in not in ours, but in different company, where like one person's frustration with a company kind of like poisons a well of suddenly everything sucks. You talk to people because all they do every day is just complain how about everything sucks. And happy employees are like, wait a second, does everything suck? So the cost is a little bit too great, I think, because we have a mortal life. We spend 8 hours of our day working. And what is more cruel than working on a meaningless thing? Like, and I understand it's an insane privilege as someone who gets to work on things they love, but
Oh yeah.
at the same time, like, I don't know. That's why I think my main source of motivation is like, also, what is your other option? Are you going to wait for the person to leave? Because motivation is not magically going to come. Like, if it happens, it's by chance, but you might as well just win a lottery. Like, at some point, something needs to be done about it. So I think some companies, especially who have as part of their value to take care of their people, in a sense that, it's a group of people, they really care about each other, whatever. It is important to give the other person, to still communicate them with them honestly that, hey, we are unhappy with your performance. It's not working out, but we would like to give you the financial security. Take your time to find a different job. And we would kind of like work with each other until you have. So there are options like that to be kinder a bit with letting go, depending on the situation. But if you look at the current work market in the US, okay, maybe not in the game industry, but overall people can find new jobs. It's not also the end.
Yeah, I guess a lot of that also then comes down to who you hire, right? Like, how much of a
Yeah,
responsibility do you have then to them to enable them? And I know we had this discussion where there were times where you were surprised by the people
yeah,
that you found to be some of those gold stars were very different to who you thought you should hire in the first place.
definitely. Yeah,
I guess how
definitely.
did that shape your perspective? What did that make you look for in people when you're looking to bring them on board that you might not have considered before?
Well, I learned that there is no sure way of hiring the right person. That is hard. Like
Yeah.
I wished there was a good way of doing hiring to be like, but even more reason why you should have a more elaborate and thought through process of hiring someone, and maybe thinking through some of these biases as well, right? So if you are a type of person who is assertive and really cares for self-expression of opinions and confidence and whatnot, are you systematically creating a disadvantage for people who are more introverted and maybe more thoughtful in their expression of thoughts? And uh, well, you might be missing some superstars in terms of performance because you might misjudge their skepticism for lack of competence, whereas what it is actually is thoughtfulness, right? So uh, my main perspective there is what everyone should do is understand the unique quirks of their own personality. And once you understand who you are as an individual, you understand the effect of your uh, let's say the quintessential part of your the properties of your personality, and then you try to catch the biases that come from that. You try to catch the disadvantages that come from that, and you try to leverage the advantages. And in hiring, that's very important because at the end of the day, we go with our guts more often than not when we are hiring. We have the metrics, we do form out the formulas, and then we are like, okay, this person scored or whatever. But sometimes you just don't have a good gut feeling, and you trust it, you're not trusted. I don't know. I've had both cases of, oh, I thought that person is amazing, but it wasn't. And sometimes I thought, I'm not sure about that, and it wasn't amazing. So it's difficult. I mean, best case scenario, you give people the chance to give you data in their performance.
Mm.
That's like the best you can do.
Yeah, it goes. Yeah, okay, so then before we wrap this up, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about learning specifically. It's kind of been a theme throughout the entire podcast today. And you seem to be very driven and passionate about just the sense of learning, the sense of achievement, growing, having all of those times for self reflection and seeing that constant growth in yourself. You just learn for learning's sake, or is there always a purpose to it? You know, obviously there's limited time, and we've had this discussion before where you obviously want to optimize it for specific outcomes. How do you take those learnings? How do you read a book and then put it into actionable sort of tools in your life?
Mm-hmm.
What is the change there? Because anyone can read a book, but people will have completely different takeaways. Some people will read a book
Yeah.
and be like, that completely changed my mindset. Others will be like, it was just a book, right? So, what is it that you take away, or what is the purpose for this learning that you want to then
Mm-hmm.
use as an actionable tool? And how do you do that going from sort of the theory of it and then using it more applicably in everyday life where it's much more messy and not always equally sort
Yeah.
of applicable?
Yeah, there's definitely a right book for the right person at the right time concept, which is you might read a book, but you're just not ready for it, in the sense that the book is imparting with you incredible wisdoms, but you just haven't like faced the problem in your real life frequently enough to really appreciate what is being said in the book. So there's definitely an aspect of that. The other aspect of like, do you just learn random stuff or do you try to make it useful? I think the older I get, the more I appreciate that uh, the value you create for others is a good thing, right? So the more when I'm learning something, I'm like, oh, I wonder if I can do something with this knowledge for other people. Can I make their life a little bit easier or more fun or less painful or whatever? So there's definitely that aspect. So I try to have a distribution because sometimes I get really cool insights from books that have nothing to do with anything. Like I have a book here about kimono design. I have a couple of books there about kimono design. I'm never going to make a kimono. Well, it's also very specific and technical of how kimonos are made or whatever. But it gave me a lot of insights about pattern studies of patterns in kimonos and how that related to art in like the Edo era in Japan and how that relates to the Southern Song in China. So it's like it connects to a sea of knowledge elsewhere And through that random search, I found it. But you can't randomly learn too much. So I try to do a distribution of like maybe 20% of the time. I'm almost learning randomly, anything that interests me. And the rest, there's this thing of like you start by tackling one real life problem that people actually have. And for that, you have to learn. So you start reading about people who have had similar problems and how did they solve it. And that is kind of like a tree that keeps on giving forever, because in every book you find more adjacent topics. And just by the way that this maps out propagates, you have coherency in the things that you're learning. Not necessarily by design, it's just it happens to be that way, that things are kind of related to each other in interesting ways. Regarding the best taking those learnings out, I do have a journal that as I'm reading, I summarize the key learning points to me that are relevant to my work and people I know and the problems they have. And that kind of ensures that I'm not reading in the air. So I am kind of like taking something out of it. And sometimes I do read books a couple of times too. There are books that I read every couple of years to just kind of like make sure that I don't forget the teachings that are inside. Because that's the other thing. Books are kind of like food. You don't remember what you ate 10 years ago. Sometimes I read a book and I'm like, this seems familiar. And after a while, I realize I have read this before, ages ago, like 10 years ago.
Nice. Yeah, just keeping those lessons. And I think, obviously, like you said, it will be different. It'll impact you differently over time. It gives me a reason to go back and read more webtoons to take away those words of wisdom too now. On that, you like to have it sort of diversified, where obviously something on actionable side, but also keeping it open to other sources and fonts of knowledge that can just randomly come into play at any point when you're looking at new ideas. I think another thing that I know you do quite often, and this is something I've seen as you grow in games, a lot of people sort of go away from things like game jams and doing side activities like that. Is the motivation for you to keep going to these things at a more senior role just to experiment more and try new learnings and new ideas? Or is there something more to going to a game jam as you've grown as a game developer and as a leader in your own right?
Mm-hmm. So that has something to do with, again, games as a medium and the idiosyncrasies of games or entertainment in general. People mistakenly think prototyping is when you try out prototyping is when you search for new game design. It's not a great efficient way of searching for new game design. Prototyping is like you test an assumption about an idea at relatively cheap cost compared to actually fully implementing an idea. So when do you actually search for new game design, right? And the problem is you can't just like search for a game design in a design document. That's an annoying thing about games is it's a whole package. It's the whole package. Like at certain games, you can take like the mechanic of a game, put it in a gray box, and it would engage you for only 5 minutes. But put it in the dressing and engage you for hours. And the whole thing around it is not irrelevant. The fantasy of it, the promise of it, what specific problem it is solving in your daily life, what needs it's hitting. So that means you need a venue where you actually research new game design ideas, right? And the process of finding new game ideas is potentially endless, right? It's not something you can like time box in a project efficiently. I mean, sometimes you do, and sometimes you're successful with it, but sometimes you could spend a really long time and not really hitting that thing. And the more people are in the team and the more stakeholders, the harder it is to hit that combination of thing that everyone is excited about. Game jams creates a landscape where people can, at low stake, try out fun concepts. Not in the sense of prototyping, because they don't really even have an assumption. It's more in the sense of like searching, right? And Sid Meier has a very interesting sentence regarding game jams, which is, well, let's say we are going to do a game jam and someone gives a concept, right? And then you're like, someone's like, you know what would be fun? I don't know, if you're like painting, you know those videos where someone's painting on the street, like the street signs, they're painting it on the ground, the asphalt,
Yeah.
right? So Sid Meier is like, okay, you look at that and you ask yourself, who has the most fun? Like, can I kind of translate that into a set of game design rules so that we really like replicate that sense of fun? And then it just creates some sort of playful field where you can try out these ideas at low stake and years later, when you actually get to your pre-production for an actual game, you have this repertoire of ideas that you can try. And if you don't want to go the Sid Meier way, the Brian Upton, the author from Aesthetic of Play, very good game designer and also amazing book. He talks about how you kind of like, and also Theory of Fun from Ralph Costa. He also talks about the same thing, which is you kind of like try to think about what set of rules creates what experiences. And game jams give you an idea of like, hey, can we create a game that replicates the feeling of winemaking? And with that, I don't mean like, leaderboards or whatever. I think you think about the process of winemaking, the weight, the beauty, the nature of it, the taste, the smell, specifics of the unique traits of each individual year. Like, can we embody that in a rule system, right? And game jams give you an idea of like a place where you can try these things out.
Nice. Yeah, so to wrap us off, just a couple more questions here. One thing I do want to know, on the flip side of, always learning, is there anything you wish you hadn't learned? I know for a lot of people that I've spoken to, there are times where it's like, like people who started working in the games industry, just imagining games before, and like, I lost some of that sense of fun. I lost some of the mystery by learning this thing. Have you ever felt that way? And how do you keep that sense of wonder alive in the things that you do that keeps you wanting to learn more about things that, I think magic's a very good example where it's like once you know the trick, sometimes it can disappoint you.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think I've ever had anything like that. And I think that's almost one of the purposes of art and artist, is to develop an eye where you can, I think I actually said this in the beginning of the interview, but you have the thing of, instead of like going to 1,000 places with the same pair of eyes, seeing the same place with 1,000 pairs of eyes. And that's almost one of the purpose of an artist, is to, okay, you learned about this aspect of that subject matter, but can you look at it from a different point of view? Does it still excite you? And man, the strangest things excite me. Like today I was walking by a trash can in Berlin, and there was a specific lighting, and I have never seen the trash can from that view before, and I just like kneeled on the ground, got dirt on my white trousers, because I had to see from my lens, from the camera, can I capture this unique thing? I don't think anyone has ever seen a trash can like that before, right? And that's really exciting. And anything that human mind can conceive is always saved in the mind in combination, in a cluster with other ideas. And it's always exciting and fun to try out the same concept with a unique new flavor that you have never seen before, be it a trash can or the rule system of a Metrovania. So in that aspect, I don't know. I don't think I regret ever learning anything.
Nice. No, I think that's one of the things I definitely appreciate the most about hanging out with you. It like gives me a different perspective as well. And last time I was in Japan, one of the most exciting sights I saw was a trash can in the streets of Tokyo. Because it's very rare to find those. Trust me, I've looked. But yeah, no, I think having that sense of wonder and keeping that almost childlike glee is one of those things that you still have, which I know a lot of people when you're working, when you're kind of living life, it can sometimes with the nihilistic view or whatever kind of get in the way. But that's one of the things I always really appreciate whenever we talk and I learn more about like, okay, maybe I can view it this way. And yeah, I think you've had some great recommendations for me in terms of the books on composition, which have somewhat helped me. I think I still have a ways to go. But yeah, so I think closing this out, what would be some, I mean, you've mentioned a lot of books, a lot of different learning resources throughout this thing, but if you could just choose something like your top 5 for who you are today, that's just come straight to mind, what would be some of the books that you'd recommend to listeners?
I always have a hard time recommending books because those posts on Facebook, like the 30 books you should read before you die, and it's like,
Yeah.
I always laugh my ass. I was like, what do you mean it's 30 books? And it's like always like the meditation or something, which is a good book. I've read it's okay, but I don't know. So I think the thing is that everyone's journey through reading books is unique. There's so much literature out there that it's kind of a shame to kind of bring it down to a pop culture, because there's just so much out there, right? And I think these idiosyncrasies are just kind of the point. So that's why I have a hard time recommending people to go and read, like, I don't know, whatever books. I can tell you books that have affected me greatly, but people, it might be very unsuited to other people to read. Like, for example, one of my favorite books is Language of Vision, but by Georges Kepes, who was one of the new Bauhaus stuff in America, who started a new school of Bauhaus, and he designed, like, taught school of designers, and like Paul Rand and Milton Glaser and Saul Bass. I already mentioned Saul Bass. Some of the greatest designers of the last century are very heavily inspired by the new Bauhaus, and these guys basically created graphic design in a sense, like, so art for marketing. Incredible book, History of Art or whatever, or Vision by Hans Bacher, who's one of the ex-Disney guys who has done incredible thing. So those books are really enjoyable. But at the same time, I can't really recommend Language of Vision to anyone because it reads like the manifesto of kind of like abstractionism or whatever. Sentences don't have verbs. Like you're like, why is it written like this crap? Or like Finite and Infinite Play, which is a book that really shook me. But again, it's a book that if you don't have a love for the poetic and you read it, you're like, what is this pretentious crap? So again, for different people, different things. Difficult Conversations was another book that really changed my opinion about. I like looked back over the years to many conversations I had, and I thought I was wrong. And that's interesting because a book can change everything about you going back a decade. That's very interesting. I also really, really like the few books, the first books of the Five Dialogues, the first like 2, 3 books. Those are the only, like almost only written records of Socrates. And I think early Socrates in the early works of Plato are just one of the most interesting characters in the whole of fiction. Just very dynamic, very annoying, and inquisitive. So those are definitely books that I very much enjoy, but I have a hard time recommending them to other people. So my actual recommendation is, if you have a topic you're interested in, or any acute problem you're trying to solve, whatever it might be, chances are there are amazing books on it. So just Google, you will get
Google what you want.
Google a book, and then I promise you, when you're reading the book, the author will mention 10 different books. And before you know it, you have a library of hundreds of books because you're constantly ordering new books. For every book you read, there's 10 new books you have to read. So you're never going to run out, but it's going to be a very unique journey to you. I recently discovered, for example, that I'm a sucker for boardroom dramas and like corporate dramas. So two of them, my most enjoyable books from the past couple of years, was Wirecard, about this German startup that was money laundering billions and working with like the Russian mafia or whatever, and Theranos, the Bad Blood book, which was, a 19-year-old that fooled Kissinger, and it's amazing stuff. I really enjoy those stuff, but it's again very interesting project. It's like, I don't know if other people would enjoy it.
Nice. No, I mean, I think there's a lot of good recommendations for a whole variety of different needs there. So yeah, before we close it off, I do have one kind of general ending question that I try to ask all the guests here. And I mean, we've kind of mentioned this, where you've essentially stumbled upon a lot of the ideas that have given you the success in your indie career so far. But do you think it is enough to just have a fun idea to have a successful game in this market, or do you need more than just a fun concept?
I mean, whether you have a fun idea or not is almost irrelevant to the success of the product, which is, I don't even think it's sad per se. It's like, you can't abstract away the end user from the solution to the problem, right? So anytime someone talks about a model of game development that doesn't directly include the end user, because you can have a very interesting, fun game, mechanically speaking, that just no one is interested in, right? So that's the part, is that I think reframing of that is thinking about, okay, who is this for? Why do they need it? How can I fulfill that need? And how do I find these people who need this? Can they pay what my production cost would be? How do I convince them and communicate with them that this is an adequate solution to the problem they have? And games, at the end of the day, they do fulfill something in their individual lives. And the thing that makes it hard to generalize is that games fulfill so many different things because people have such expansive set of motivations as to why they play, right? You could take two different motivations from extremes that categorically almost have nothing to do with each other. So it's kind of like hard to fulfill, to create a mental model that covers both of them. But for example, instead of just being like, okay, this setup mechanic is fun, you would be like, okay, I'm creating a game for people who have that need of playing for 10-15 minutes after work and kind of like turning their brain off, but they don't want to kind of jump into an endless time sink. They want to be able to foresee ahead of the time how much time they're spending, for example. So that's a very specific value proposition to the player, right? And then you just have to do that value proposition good. And if you have done your market research, that value proposition is actually useful to sufficiently enough number of people who can financially pay you for your effort. And I think that's what success of a video game comes down to, more than looking at a video game independent of the entire chain of consumption. So the whole thing is the package, kind of back to back.
Always have the user in mind from the start. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it's been an amazing, I guess, almost 2 hours that we're coming on, speaking to you about all of this. Is there anything you want to shout out? Where can people reach you? Anything you've got interesting in the works? Anything else?
So yeah, sure. I mean, you can check out my weblog, the blog posts, if you want to, if you're interested in the type of things that I talk about. Other than that, you can follow me on various social medias. I'm less active nowadays than I used to be, mostly because I kind of feel like most social medias have changed to this attention economy, where it's kind of meaningless to shout in the void. But I definitely am still putting out blogs around my learnings. Regarding shout outs, nothing much. If you haven't tried Puzzling Places, go and try Puzzling Places. It's a fun game. We are proud of bringing so much cultural heritage into the stage of video games and kind of gamifying paying attention on cultural heritage. It's a fun game that kind of like teaches you a bit about the world around you. And other than that, all I can say, if any of the books I talked about kind of like interest you, I can recommend them from the point of view of I had fun reading them, and you might too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Shah. It's been really fun talking to you, and it's been great to have you on this podcast. I know when I first thought up of this, you were definitely one of the guests that I was most excited about bringing on here, because I know I always learn a lot and take a lot away from you. So it's been, I think, a really insightful conversation that I hope a lot of our listeners can also learn a lot from as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
Awesome. We'll leave it at that.